committed to the task of publishing clear, readable English texts. It honors the deep faith, spirit, and concern of the late Reverend Dr. Numata Yihin to disseminate Buddhist teachings throughout the world. In July 1996, the committee unfortunately lost its valued chairperson, Dr. Filip Yampolsky, who was a stalwart leader, trusted friend, and esteemed colleague. We follow in his shadow. In February 1997, I was appointed to guide the committee in his place. The committee is charged with the normal duties of a publishing firm: general editing, formatting, copy editing, proofreading, indexing, and checking linguistic fidelity. The committee members are Diane Ames, Aisho Nasu, Charles Nimi, Ko Nishik, and the president and director of the Numata Center, Reverend Kiyoshi S. Yamashita. Kenneth K. Inada, chairperson, July 10, 1999 Publication Committee. Contents: a message on the publication of the English Tripitaka Numata Yihin editorial forward Meiva Sengoku. Publishers forward Kenneth K. Inada. Hsiian-tsang, the 30 verses on consciousness only Vasubandhu, the treatise in 20 verses on consciousness only Vasubandhu glossary. Selected bibliography.
Translator's Introduction. The name of the text that I have translated as Demonstration of Consciousness Only is Hsiian-tsang wei-shih Luan, number 1585 in the Japanese Taisho Shinshi Dazed Key 6 edition of the Buddhist canon. Its author was the Chinese monk scholar Hsiian-tsang, 600–64, who also translated about 75 Sanskrit Buddhist texts. It is said that Hsiian-tsang decided to travel to India in search of answers to questions he could not find in the Buddhist texts available to him in China and to find more important texts to bring back. He set out for India in 629, arriving at the great Buddhist University of Nalanda in India in 633, after a long and hazardous land voyage through the deserts of Central Asia and the icy mountains of northwest India. During the 5 years he spent at Nalanda, he discovered the verse treatise Trimsika-vijnaptimatrata by the famous monk scholar Vasubandhu, along with 10 prose commentaries on these 30 verses by Dharmapala, Sthiramati, Nanda, Citrabhanu, Gunamati, Jinamitra, Jhanacandra, Bandhusri, Suddhacandra, and Jinaputra. The 30 verses and the 10 commentaries became the basis for Hsiian-tsang's Hsiian-tsang wei-shih Luan. He returned to China in 645 and set about to translate this and a number of other texts he had brought with him.
The Hsiian-tsang wei-shih Luan is presented simply as a translation of Vasubandhu's verses and the commentaries, but in fact Hsiian-tsang was selective in his use of the commentaries. He seems to have decided that Dharmapala's interpretation of the verses was the correct one. Consequently, of the 10 commentaries, only 3 are consistently used, with a 4th occasionally appearing. When Hsiian-tsang presents the interpretations, he usually gives those of Sthiramati, Nanda, and Dharmapala, occasionally including that of Citrabhanu. The interpretation given last, that of Dharmapala, is invariably considered the correct one. Consequently, for all practical purposes, the text consists of the translation of the 30 verses, generally referred to as the treatise, plus the interpretation of Dharmapala as the correct view, with the supplementation of 2 or 3 divergent interpretations. There is some question among Buddhist scholars whether Dharmapala's interpretation of the doctrine of consciousness only was what Vasubandhu intended in his verses.
Hsiian-tsang's disciple Keichi created an independent school based on the Hsiian-tsang wei-shih Luan, known in China as the Feixiang school, school of the characteristics of dharmas, and as wei-shih, consciousness only. This school was one of the earliest to be introduced to Japan, where it is known as the Hasso, Feixiang school. The text and the shu have had very important places in the development of East Asian Buddhism, and the text is still the object of considerable interest and study. In my translation, I have indicated the 30 verses by uppercase print, both when the verses are introduced and subsequently when each term is defined and discussed by the commentaries.
Vasubandhu's verses and the prose commentaries may be seen as an attempt to clarify the question of how ignorance, avidyat, or delusion, moha, take place and how they are removed, since this is the Buddhist task par excellence. The question may be restated as that of how deluded, erroneous perception and knowledge can be replaced with enlightened, unerring perception and knowledge. While all Buddhists agreed that the fundamental obstacle to the life of liberation and compassion was ignorance of the real nature of events, there is a need to show systematically, rigorously, and in detail what the mechanism of ignorance is, as well as the process of liberation. Hsiian-tsang's text is an attempt to answer the question of the mechanism and nature of ignorance by demonstrating that seemingly real external objects of perception, dharma, and the equally seemingly real self, Iman, who perceives these things are mental fabrications that do not exist apart from consciousness itself. Consequently, there are no real external objects to crave, fear, dominate, be subject to, or otherwise be obsessed with. By the same token, there is no real, unchanging inner self that craves, fears, and so on. Both the grasper or knowing self, grahaka, and the grasped, graya, are mere mental constructs.
To believe that there is a self and really existing external things that are meaningful to the self is delusion and results in suffering, confusion, and the incapacity for benevolence and compassion. To realize that the self and apparently real things are only mental images results in the ability to endure suffering patiently, with clarity, and the Buddhist life of compassion. Thus liberation and Buddhahood result from the realization that selves and real external things are nothing but ideas, vijnaptimatrata, or, as Hsiian-tsang expresses it, consciousness only, wei-shih. The theory of the Hsiian wei-shih luan is that basic or fundamental consciousness, malavijjna, comes to appear naturally and spontaneously in the form of a seeing part, darsanabhaga, and a seen part, nimittabhaga. The seeming reality of an inner self perceiving external events is nothing more than one aspect of consciousness perceiving itself in the form of images. A third part of consciousness, the manas, or thinking aspect, interprets the two parts as a self and an external world. This situation is also the basis for hatred, craving, fear, and other passions. In fact, the apparently real external world of things is nothing but internal images perceived by consciousness and grasped as a source of attachment by thought.
The question of the origin of these images is answered by the theory of seeds, bija. The term seed is a metaphor for a potentiality that can become one of the images of consciousness, in the same way that a real seed is the potential for the later mature plant. Some of these seed potentials are innate, while others are acquired through experience. They can be potentials for impurity and unwholesomeness or for purity and wholesomeness. They are all harbored in root consciousness which, in its capacity of storing them, is referred to as store consciousness, glaya vijnadana. The process of becoming enlightened and a Buddha is portrayed as a purification process whereby the seeds of impurity and unwholesomeness are destroyed and the seeds of purity and wholesomeness are increased. This process is known as the transmutation of the support, at Sriya referring to the total, drastic change in the nature of the root consciousness, the support of both kinds of seeds. In the course of describing this transmutation, whereby one changes from an ordinary, deluded being into a Buddha, the Hsiian wei-shih luan undertakes a long, detailed explanation of the nature and functions of 8 kinds of consciousness, with particular emphasis.